Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to hold on for a few seconds while our platform lets everyone in. But in the meantime, you're welcome to use the chat box to say hello and let us know where you're tuning in from today, and we'll get started in just a minute. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Happy February, and welcome to today's webinar, Caring for Yourself While Caring for Others During the Pandemic, Self-Care and Stress Inoculation. My name is Em Scahill. I'm the Director of Public Awareness and Education at Mental Health America's National Office, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. A few notes before I introduce our presenter today. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be emailed out to all registrants within 1 week. We don't offer CEUs, but if you would like a certificate of attendance, we have a form for you to request one, and I'll post the link to that form in the chat box shortly, and it will be included in the follow-up email as well. And last but not least, we've built in some time for a Q&A, so please post your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and we'll go through some at the end, and feel free to make comments or share some of your knowledge in there as well. And now I'm so excited to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Carla Vermeulen. Carla Vermeulen is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health and an Associate Professor of Psychology at SUNY New Paltz, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in disaster mental health, grief counseling, and developmental psychology. She also oversees the Student Psychological Resilience Project in the Advanced Certificate in Trauma and Disaster Mental Health program. In addition to teaching and research, she has coordinated the development and production of training curricula on disaster mental health for the New York State Department of Health and Office of Mental Health, the American Red Cross, the United Nations, and other organizations. She's co-author of Disaster Mental Health Interventions, Core Principles and Practices, and co-editor of Disaster Mental Health Case Studies, Lessons Learned from Counseling in Chaos. Her third book, Generation Disaster, Coming of Age Post 9/11, was published in August 2021 as part of the Oxford University Press Emerging Adulthood series. She has so much great information to share with us today, so I'll turn it over to her to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Em. Thanks to Mental Health America for inviting me to give this talk. This is actually a talk that my colleague, Dr. Amy Nitze, the Executive Director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, and I kind of co-developed pretty early on in the pandemic, and we've been refining it ever since as things continue to change and this continues to last. I certainly never expected it would be lasting to February 2022, and who knows how much further. So we have just found that, what people need right now is just validation of the stress that they are going through, and then some actual tangible ways to cope with that stress. So that is what I'm going to try and cover today. I really hope you're going to come out of this hour with some actual skills or new approaches to dealing with your own stress. And then, of course, if you are better able to manage your stress, that means you're better able to help others, which I'm pretty sure pretty much everyone in this audience has some involvement in doing. So I'm going to talk about just kind of a quick overview of just stress reactions in general, so we can understand why we're all feeling the way we're feeling. Then some particular stressors related to the outbreak, even though that's really kind of individual for every person. We will certainly talk about pathways to building your resilience and handling your own stress. And then I'll finish up by talking about stress inoculation, which is a very sort of cognitively focused approach to dealing with stressful situations. So throughout this, I will not be looking at the chat while I'm talking because I would get totally distracted by that. But Em is going to be monitoring that, and she will kind of curate the questions that we'll come to at the end. So hopefully we'll have some good time for that. Okay, so a quick overview of stress reactions. And for some of you, I realize this might be a review, but I think it's still kind of useful to revisit periodically. So I think one of the points that my colleagues and I really like to make is this idea of stress being this kind of flexible thing. My background is primarily in disaster mental health. So what we tend to be dealing with in the people that we're training, the responders that we work with, the responses that we're doing, is the single red dot, the trauma dot, where somebody goes through a particularly difficult experience and that overwhelms their ability to cope with what they have gone through. And so they are sort of immediately or directly or acutely put into that state of trauma. That is certainly still something that goes on for many people. Unfortunately, clearly disasters did not pause while the pandemic has been unfolding. But I think in terms of what most of us have been dealing with, it's also really key to recognize this notion that you can start with stress, the stuff that you're maybe kind of keeping, you're keeping yourself afloat, you're able to sort of deal with generally. And I'll break down the different types of that next. But then if that bullseye keeps growing, all those stressors keep adding up, that can sort of reach this point where you're really becoming overwhelmed. You're not able to use whatever your typical coping mechanisms would be. And that can push you into a state of crisis. And then if that continues, that really can be significant to put people into a state of trauma. And I think a lot of people really are at that stage right now. Parents for sure, teachers for sure, healthcare professionals for sure. There's a lot of people where what normally they would have been able to handle, it's just been too much. So let's kind of keep that framework in mind throughout what I'm going to talk about. So the different kinds of stress, we can think about this in terms of stressors that are acute, cumulative, or traumatic. So I'll talk through each of these in turn. Whoops, no, I won't. So acute stressors are really the kind of, the things where you recognize when something is happening. So, there's some kind of what feels like a crisis. There's some particular specific thing that happens. And that does sort of get you into that yellow mode of having to deal with those stressors. And we've all got those. I'm sure you can think about acute stressors that you have to deal with. They're the little fires you have to put out on a regular basis. Cumulative stress in many ways is more harmful. That is just that buildup. That is just where it's one thing on top of another, on top of another. And maybe you're still able to tread water, but you certainly can't get your feet on the bottom and stand up and get yourself out of that mode. And then traumatic stressors, that's kind of what I talked about before. That's where you really have that kind of critical incident that occurs. That could be a health crisis, that could be losing your job, that certainly could be going through a disaster, accident, assault, anything like that. So I think just keeping in mind, we tend to kind of lump these all together into just being stress. But each of these puts different demands on us in terms of coping. And each of these really requires different approaches to solving or reducing or just managing or mitigating these stressors. Okay, and then I always like to point out as well that not all stress is negative. We need some degree of stress to keep us challenged and motivated and growing. The stress, the term itself, even though it's sort of taken on this negative connotation, it really just refers to anything that requires us to adapt or to respond. And so, this is kind of this classic performance versus stress inverted U-shaped curve, where if we don't have enough stress at the green side, we are unmotivated, we don't feel challenged, we don't feel like there's a reason to get up in the morning. Frankly, I think not having enough stress in life feels like kind of a nice thing at the moment for a lot of us, but generally that's really kind of not the ideal situation if we want to sort of live our best lives. Clearly, we can have too much stress and get into the red side of things where you are overwhelmed. And again, that's where you're, moving towards the traumatic spot in that bullseye. But there is this sweet spot in the middle, this kind of peak ideal level of stress, which is referred to not very commonly. I wish the word was better known, but this is what we call eustress. So it's the equivalent to distress, meaning negative stress, eu meaning positive, like euphoria. That's where, you really are feeling like you're being challenged, like you are bringing all of your skills and applying them, like you are helping other people, like you are being your best self, however that is defined for you. So, it's not all bad, but keeping it in that middle area is really challenging for sure. So just a few other notes about these stress and trauma reactions, and I'll define them in just a second. But please keep in mind, these are not pathological. These are not abnormal reactions. These are understandable. We used to, in the disaster field, we used to often use the phrase, you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. I don't like that language. I think normal is just kind of, I don't know, stigmatizing or judgmental or however you want to describe it. But, these are, I think it's better to explain these as reactions that just, they make sense. You're being asked to respond in ways that are really exceeding that eustress capacity. And therefore, of course, you're going to be feeling that in a negative sense. And then sometimes, like with the acute stressors I talked about before, sometimes the thing happens, you realize, oh man, this is just added to my stress level. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just like, okay, it's just another thing, until you reach that level, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back kind of analogy. And then this idea of our stress reactions changing over time, often that is in a positive way if what we're dealing with is an acute stressor. So, if something happens, you respond to it, you adapt to it, you learn how to live with it, you learn how to cope with it, or you learn how to reduce that stressor and, actually minimize it, ideally. Typically, then we will talk about this kind of idea of returning to baseline. I'll use that analogy a lot throughout this. So, you're perking along in your life, whatever your typical stress level is, the thing happens, your stress gets amped up for a bit. Generally, over time, you're going to come back to that baseline again. But that is not always going to be the case, particularly if you're getting amped up and amped up and amped up all over again. And then also really key to recognize that our stress reactions don't just occur in our emotions, but they occur across these multiple realms. So obviously the emotions are probably the things we're most looking for or most aware of. And those really, for people with dealing with stress, I like to sort of think of this as, in some cases, those are more internalizing emotional symptoms, and sometimes they're more externalizing. So sometimes we feel, sad and depressed and overwhelmed, and we want to withdraw. Those are sort of the internalizing. Sometimes we are really mad and really frustrated and really anxious, and are lashing out because we're just so overwhelmed. So those are more the kind of externalizing. Then, of course, a lot of people carry their stress reactions physically. They have, physiological symptoms or responses, in addition to, or more strongly sometimes than, emotional ones. And so those can be, well, I'm sure we've all got our particular way. I mean, for me, I find like when my jaw and my neck are feeling really tense, that's a sign that I'm under stress. Some people get stress stomach aches, stress headaches, heart palpitations, digestive issues, all of these things. And certainly the impact on sleep is enormous. When we are stressed out, we typically don't sleep very well. We can't fall asleep, can't stay asleep. And then of course that becomes sort of, that reinforces and makes it harder to deal with everything, because now you're depleted physically because of that. And also good to recognize, for some cultures, particularly Asian cultures, it's much more like socially acceptable to say you have a physical symptom than to express an emotion. So, it's sort of more okay to say I have a headache than to say I'm anxious or I'm depressed. So that's something to watch out for as well. Stress certainly can impact our behaviors. And here again, you sort of have the internalizing, externalizing divide. So some people who are stressed, they just want to go to bed and not face the world and not talk to anyone. So, they withdraw, they avoid whatever they need to do. They are, basically just kind of not coping. They're trying to escape or avoid because it's just too hard to cope with what they need to. Unfortunately, that is very not helpful, because first of all, we know that reaching out to social connections is actually the most valuable thing that you can do when you are in a state of stress or distress. So that kind of social withdrawal is very counterproductive. And then of course, avoiding dealing with the problem, also not helpful, because you can't avoid it forever. And then clearly some people get into self-medicating. I mean, there's been a lot of attention to this during the pandemic, much higher rates of drinking to a problematic level, drug use. And so that again is a way of sort of numbing your emotions and avoiding what you need to deal with. So that clearly can become problematic for a lot of people. The cognitive realm, this is one that I find often people don't even really necessarily connect to the stress that they're under. But when we're stressed, our brains are just so tied up in everything we're trying to deal with. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. But people who are stressed can't remember anything, they can't focus, they can't accomplish what they need to. It's just, your brain is in a fog essentially because of everything you're dealing with. And then spirituality is sort of interesting. For some people going through a difficult time, that can lead to a real increase in their faith. That sense that, okay, I'm going through a hard time, but, God or whatever the higher power they believe in is never gives us more than we can handle, or this is God's plan or God's will or something like that. But clearly for a lot of people, that is not a source of comfort, even if it might be in other times. For a lot of people who are going through very difficult times, there can be that question of, why is God doing this to me? Why am I being punished? And that can be a really existential question for people, who would normally take some comfort from their faith, but now they're really questioning that deep part of their selves. So that can be very painful. So those are kind of the main realms we typically see. And then a couple of others that I think really need to be recognized is shame and guilt. So people define these differently. I tend to define them as shame is really the sense that there's something intrinsically wrong with me, versus guilt is the sense that I did something wrong or I didn't do something that I should have done. So shame is sort of deeper and more, again, existential, more fundamental, but guilt is bad enough. And, I'm sure we can all think of something that we have felt guilty about during the pandemic or just in other times in general. We always think we could have done more, especially people who go to the helping professions. There's always, yes, more you could have done, more you could have given, someone you could have been kinder to, another volunteer request you could have accepted, and so on. So I think just kind of forgiving ourselves and recognizing that there are limits and that this guilt, it's a very, very real and significant feeling, but often it's really based in these kind of distorted perceptions about what you actually could have managed to do, what could have been expected of you. So these are areas where sometimes kind of doing that, well, if your friend was telling you they felt guilty about this, what would you think that that was, an accurate perception, to try and get people to at least recognize where they're judging themselves too harshly. That can sometimes be helpful. And then, so that's all kind of life in general. Now we come to what we've all been dealing with for the last 2 years. And I'm going to talk about just some broader patterns that we've seen, but every one of you in this audience has your own combination of stressors that you are dealing with. So, I will say, I am not a parent. I have never been as happy to not be a parent as I have been in this, because you guys have had it really rough. So, just thinking about what your own combination of these are, but these are kind of the sort of societal issues that certainly are apparent. One is just something we've known from past public health outbreaks and public health emergencies is it's just creepy. Anything where you have that sense of wondering, have I been exposed to something? Have I taken something into my body that is going to make me sick, that is going to make my loved ones sick, that maybe I'm going to pass on to other people? That is just sort of intrinsically stress inducing for sure. And then just all of the uncertainty around the pandemic. I think that's really what at the core is what's hardest. Like, if we know what to expect, we can figure out a plan how to get to the other side. But just this, constantly changing, having to adopt all of these new policies, and then the fact that this has become so politicized really has fueled all of these particular issues. So, the fact that what seems like should be just scientifically based advice and guidance, and that has turned out not to be, just fueling the political polarization and cultural polarization that this country was already dealing with, has not been helpful for sure. Obviously, the medical fears, particularly early on in the pandemic, before the healthcare profession had really developed more effective ways of treating it, obviously before the vaccinations became available. So, just that worry and just not that just being sort of constantly present. And then, of course, the things like all of the heartbreaking cases of people being hospitalized and not being allowed to have visitors, and people even on their deathbeds, having a nurse holding up a phone or an iPad for people to say they're good. It's just horrible. I don't need to belabor this. It's just been really heartbreaking. And then not being able to follow rituals and all of those normal sources of comfort. For anyone who's in any kind of caregiving role, these concerns, if I get sick, who's going to take care of the others and me? If they get sick, how am I going to manage taking care of them along with everything else that I have to do? Economic concerns, these seem to have stabilized somewhat for at least a lot of people, but early on, so many people losing work, businesses shutting down, all the anxieties around that. I've now had 2 classes of college students graduating into an economy that has been impacted by the pandemic. So all of those concerns about launching a career in this, in addition to those further along being impacted. Work-life balance in general, for the people who had to keep working, whether that was in positions like healthcare, where they were sort of being recognized and validated and treated as heroes, yet they were being exposed to a significant danger and trauma, or the grocery store workers, the Amazon delivery people, all the people who maybe didn't get quite so much glory and certainly didn't get as much compensation for their work. Continuing to do the work while balancing that with their own fears of exposure, family members' fears of exposure. That has been brutal for so many people. For those whose work switched to remote, trying to juggle all of that, the boundary issues, and then, tough as well for supervisors, and I will say, as an educator, I kind of struggled with this myself when my college went remote in March 2020. Oh my God. Yeah, 2 years ago. But just, how do you keep whoever you're supervising or teaching, how do you keep them motivated, feeling connected, feeling optimistic, while also upholding the standards that you have to uphold? So that's been tricky as well. The broader social concerns, before I mentioned the partisan divisiveness, and that has just so added to everything. Now the ongoing discussions about getting vaccinated, boosted, all of those issues, the mask wearing, the adjustment to social distancing. And, I think this last point, I think we need to not forget about this. So many experiences got missed. And some of those maybe are things we can make up later. That right now, apparently, there are more weddings going on than at any point previously because people postpone their wedding for a year or 2 years. So now that, we're sort of catching up on those, but still the year or 2 years was missed. Some of those things can't be replaced. And some of that is, maybe not so significant seeming, like graduation ceremonies or family vacations, but those are real losses, especially for, the young people who were looking forward to this, seeing this as kind of their reward for the hard work that they've been doing. And you can't replace your prom. You can't replace your high school or college graduation. And then certainly things like not being able to hold funerals, the notion of the Zoom memorial service just breaks my heart. Now, thankfully, we're sort of able to resume some of those. But what about the people during that first year who really never got to kind of have that proper farewell to their loved one who died, including that gathering of social support, which is really the reason that we have these ceremonies? And then I also think certainly about older adults who have not been able to visit family or do the things they wanted to do, and have that kind of don't have that perspective like, okay, we have enough lifespan left ahead to be able to make some of these things up. That's just awful as well. I'm sorry, this is a very depressing talk so far, but we're going to get to what to do about it soon. So really overall, it's just, what's been so hard about it is just back to that uncertainty, that constant need to adapt, that constant need to change, to shift, to make these, I heard this term the other day, not just even making the big decisions, do I get my kids vaccinated or not, but these micro decisions, these little things like, okay, New York still has the mask mandate, basically has the mask mandate. So some of that is sort of taken out of our decision making. But those little, is it safe? Is it worth it to get together with friends for dinner? because we're going to be taking our masks off while we're eating, and we might get exposed that way. It's just so exhausting. Like I even, this is so silly, but like I have to go through this sort of checklist every day. Like, okay, am I seeing people in person? Am I going to be on video? Do I need to put lipstick on? Because if I'm only going to be in person wearing a mask, there's no point putting lipstick on. But if I'm going to be on video, I need the lipstick because I'll be visible. It's so stupid, but it takes up brain space for me every day. And it's just exhausting. Okay, so now what do we do about this? All right. Okay, actually, I'd love to hear in the chat, what are your micro decisions that you're grappling with? I'd love to like get to hear some of those, because again, they're on the surface, they seem so ridiculous, and yet it is, once again, a thing we have to be dealing with. All right, so stress management. And some of this will be familiar to everybody, but then I'll get into the stress inoculation, which I think will probably be new for a lot of people. So we in the helping professions, mental health, teaching, et cetera, we are really, really good at telling other people they need to practice self-care, and we are not always good at that ourselves. So let's get beyond lip service with this, and let's all make a vow that we're actually going to do this because we need to. So we like to describe this, my Institute for Disaster Mental Health colleagues, as this self-care imperative. And that is this notion that it's the stupid put your oxygen mask on first analogy, but it is genuinely true. If we don't take care of ourselves, we are going to get depleted, we are going to get burned out, we are going to get compassion fatigue, and we are not going to be able to help other people. So it is not a luxury to take care of ourselves. It should be part of our jobs. It should be just like we go to trainings like this, just like we do continuing education, just like we're trying to learn new skills. This should be a baked in part of our professional responsibilities. But I know that's far easier said than done. And I also know that telling you all that you need to do better at self-care, and I don't mean for it to be chiding like that, that is probably adding to your stress right now. So that is the last thing I want to do. But I do want to encourage you to really kind of reframe your thinking around this so that it's not selfish to take care of yourself. It's actually legitimately part of what you need to do to uphold your professional responsibility. Okay, hopefully I've belabored that point sufficiently. So this is what's referred to as the compassion stress continuum. And this was kind of put into words by Charles Figley, who's, I'm sure many of you have studied his work, but he really, looked at people who were working with people exposed to trauma and working in very difficult situations. For him, partly that was humanitarian crises, working with military, veterans, service members, and sort of recognizing that there really is this continuum. People who are drawn to this field choose to do hard work because we get satisfaction out of it. That is when we are in that state of eustress. I mean, think about some of your hardest days at work might also probably be some of your most rewarding days, at least in hindsight, when you really feel like you are doing it. You are doing what you set out professionally to do, or just as a human being, what you want to do to be a good person and empathetic person who helps others. That is awesome. However, it is very easy for us to kind of slide down that continuum, first gradually and then rapidly often, into the state of compassion fatigue. So again, compassion satisfaction is that pleasure that we get from that work, that feeling of reward and satisfaction. For anyone who's not familiar with it, I really recommend this instrument, the ProQual. It's the Professional Quality of Life survey or instrument. Free online, they have it in multiple languages. It's just a really great little checklist that you can go through, and then you self-assess yourself, and it lets you know kind of where you are on scales for compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, and burnout. And I really like it. I recommend doing it like every month or so, just to have a little check-in with yourself to see maybe like, ooh, maybe I'm kind of tipping down that continuum a little bit and I need to do something about it. So great instrument, highly recommended. The compassion fatigue, this is just what happens when you have given and given and given of yourself professionally, personally, and you just have nothing left to give. The phrase that gets used a lot is, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to pause and replenish your own cup so that you can keep going, keep doing it. And so this can be gradual. Fortunately, it can be addressed with just taking a break, taking on those self-care practices. But it's important to do this because I find for people who get into the helping fields, we do that because that desire to help others, that sense of being a compassionate person, that's not just something we do, that is part of our identity. And when we find ourselves in this state of compassion fatigue, it's not just like burnout. It's not just like, oh, I need to take a vacation. It's like, I don't know if I want to keep doing the career that I dedicated my entire life to. And so that's a huge blow. And really, sometimes people don't come back from that. I mean, there's all this talk about the great resignation right now. Some people are realizing, nope, it is just asking too much of me. And I get that. Some jobs specifically certainly are, but there are things you can do to try and prevent that. Okay, so a few notes on resilience, which is such a buzzword right now, but it's a good buzzword. I'm glad it's sort of getting the focus that it is. So people define this differently. In the disaster mental health field, we tend to describe it not so much as bouncing back quickly after a disaster, after negative reactions to a disaster, but really not having strong negative reactions in the first place. Some people can go through something that I might find devastating, and they're just kind of able to keep going because they have that resilience. People sometimes used to describe resilience as more of a trait than a state. So it was like a stable personality characteristic or skill. You either had it or you didn't. I don't think that's true at all. I absolutely think it is something that is subject to development, to growth. People can absolutely build up their resilience. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this training. But basically it is this ability to kind of re-stabilize yourself. I talked about that baseline thing later. Part of that is being able to get back to your baseline more quickly. And part of that is preventing that kind of ratcheting up of your baseline stress level from occurring in the first place. So this notion of responding versus reacting, or really overreacting to stressful or difficult situations. So people have all sorts of different analogies for this. You might have read the Bessel van der Kolk talks about this, and the body carries the score. So this, I think, is just kind of a simple way of thinking about this. What we want to do is train our brains so that basically we're able to stay in that kind of green zone, on the Eustress slide, it was actually shown in yellow, but at that point where, yes, we are adapting as we need to, but we are doing that at an appropriate level. We're not getting overwhelmed. And we are basically coming at new stressors as, okay, this is something I have to deal with, but I am going to start from this position that I can do it. So viewing it as a challenge rather than a threat, which I'll come back to in the stress inoculation part. Unfortunately, when we are in that state, especially of cumulative stress, leading into crisis, leading into trauma, that is when basically we often describe this as the brain getting hijacked by our emotions. So that is when your fight or flight mode gets activated. Even if the threat isn't a physical threat to your health or your threat of injury, we still respond to social threats. Threats to our standing, threats to our status, and certainly threats to our loved ones. It's the same response. It's still that physiologic or that sympathetic nervous system arousal, fight or flight response. And when we're in that state, I'm sure everyone is aware of this. It's fine. We've evolved for that. We've adapted for that. If it's that acute stressor, and then you get the chance to come back down. When we are staying in that amped up state, it is very bad for us, all of our bodily systems. It's not just stressful, but it is associated with heart disease, diabetes, all sorts of bigger issue physical reactions. And the other factor is, of course, when we're in that state, our brains are not at their best. Our brains are trying to keep us alive by trying to fight down that threat, but they are not leaving much room for thinking at that highest rational level. So it's almost like when we're in this state of feeling in danger, our animal brain takes over and it's only trying to keep us alive. It's not trying to come up with good solutions to the issue that we are confronted with. So the good news is there are multiple ways that you can try and focus on building your resilience, building your tolerance for stress. So we like to think of this in terms of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And the good news is that all three of these really reinforce and feed into and strengthen each other. So as I'm talking through these, please think about which of these just kind of appeals to you the most, and what might you do to try and maybe start your resilience building efforts focused on that one, with the hope that then that will, lead to these others as well. So emotion-based ones, these are really the things that we tend to think of now, mindfulness, meditation, these are things that are really helping us calm ourselves down more readily, get control over that fight or flight response to at least some degree, keep our focus better. And a lot of this stuff like mindfulness is really focused on identifying what we're feeling, recognizing it, and not judging ourselves, and then kind of further fueling that negative spiral. So here's are some strategies. I'm sure this is not news to any of you that these are all things that are very good for you. Many of these are things you can do for free or for very little expense. You can do them almost anywhere. You can download apps that will help you with them. These are great. They're absolutely powerful and important. And I always acknowledge I am not good at these. I keep trying. I'm not going to stop trying, but I find it really hard to get into that kind of state where this is sufficient to kind of help me deal with whatever stressors I'm dealing with. And these shouldn't be sufficient. These should be in interaction with the other pathways. But this is the one I am worst at. But a lot of people, this is the one that feels most natural and most helpful for them. The behavior-based ones, there's certainly some overlap with the emotion-based ones. Yoga could apply here as well. But really the goal for these is to recognize that, like I said before, a lot of the stressors, the threats that we are dealing with in modern life are not physical threats. They are social threats, psychological threats, but that is not what our fight or flight systems evolved to deal with. And so we're left with this kind of state where, it's not like you have to run away from the saber-toothed tiger and that process of running away releases all of the stress hormones in your system. So you're back to baseline afterwards. These are ways to recognize you've got all of these chemicals in your body, cortisol in particular, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and these are things that we need some physical way to get out of our systems. So the goal with this is really give your body a way of recognizing, okay, I'm not in danger, and burning those chemicals off, those hormones off. So this could be formal exercise. That's great if that appeals to you. That it does not have to be anything that formal. Other way, like I find sometimes literally like just shaking my hands, like literally shake it off, or just take a big deep breath, just something that kind of shocks the body a little bit and lets it know, okay, you got into this mode of defensiveness that's not helpful right now. So these are all, again, pretty easy things to try, and don't feel like if you're not into going for a 5-mile run, these are off limits to you. Just find something little and test that out and get in the habit of it. And then the cognition-based ones, that's what I'll spend the rest of this on, and then we will have some time for Q&A. These, I think, don't get nearly enough attention. But for anyone who's studied cognitive behavioral therapies, some of this might sort of look familiar a little bit, especially the part about the self-talk. So this is this notion of just, how are we thinking about how we're thinking? How are we thinking about how we're feeling? What is the little voice in our heads saying about the threat that we are dealing with, about the stressors we're confronted with, and really like actively talking ourselves into thinking about these things in a different way. So some of that is the basic self-talk. For anyone who's interested in cognitive behavioral therapy, this is like the ABC worksheet stuff. I'll refer you back to that. But I will now lead you through stress inoculation, which I love. For me, I've gotten in the habit of doing this the way a lot of other people get in the habit of practicing mindfulness or exercising or things like that. I really wish, I think we should teach this to children starting in second grade and then remind them of it every year until, I don't know, for the rest of their lives. I hope you'll find this useful. If you don't, that's great. This might be the one that doesn't appeal to you, but here's just another tool for your toolkit. Okay, so stress inoculation is basically starting with the premise that some things in our lives are going to be stressful. We cannot get rid of that. That is just a fact of modern life. That is a fact of our jobs, a fact of our families, a fact of our health, etc. So our goal here, as it says, is to manage that stress, not to pretend that we can get rid of it because we can't. So that is helpful in a lot of ways, because if we acknowledge something's going to be stressful, we're not blindsided by it. We're not pretending it's not going to be stressful. And then this point about managing your expectations, I think this is really helpful because a lot of people, I'll include myself in this, tend to have expectations of or tendencies towards perfectionism. And there can often be this self-judgment where if you didn't do it perfectly, you failed, right? So it's very black and white thinking. And there's a lot of gray area in between there. So part of it is just recognizing, okay, if I'm going to be doing this, whatever task for the first time, I'm not going to be perfect at it. And that's okay. I'm going to do it as well as I can. I'm going to think about what I can do better next time. I'm going to feed that back into that loop. So I will do better next time, but I am not going to criticize myself excessively if I don't nail it the first time. And then just thinking about, how intense are these emotions likely to be? I'll come back to that in a second. And really the key to it is this mental practice, this mental preparation. So it's almost like doing a dry run. So this ideally is something that you do a little bit in advance of something. You have a big presentation you're doing for 500 people the next day, you do it the day before. What are you anxious about? Whatever it might be, ideally you kind of do this for enough time that you get to kind of run through those scenarios a few times. But I find now that I'm, kind of a regular practicer of this, I can do it pretty quickly. I'm about to open the door and walk into a new classroom or a meeting for the first time, and I can kind of at least get a quick run through. So 3 steps to this. You're going to identify the potential stressors that are concerning you. You're going to appraise those at 2 different levels, and then you're going to figure out how are you going to cope with those stressors. Okay, so first step of this, identifying the stressors. In this case, what you're trying to do is really, really identify, get beyond that sort of, oh, I have this sort of vague dread about what I'm being asked to do, and really pinpoint it. What are you anxious about? What are you worried about? And that is going to be totally different from person to person. And so, I think a fairly silly but good example of this is, for me, doing this kind of presentation. I do a lot of these. I'm no longer, I certainly used to be, but the public speaking part of it doesn't make me anxious really any longer. The potential for technological failure makes me very anxious. So other people might have the totally opposite thing. Go with your gut on this. Even though this is a cognitive approach, just really listen to your brain and your body. What is it that you're concerned about? And sometimes that's, tangible physical stimuli that you might be exposed to. Very often that is that you're going to be dealing with people who are very upset or very angry or are asking you to do things you don't think you can do. Again, just whatever it might be, think through for yourself. What is it that's bugging you about this? Then you're going to appraise it at these 2 different levels. So first, how are you thinking about this? Are you viewing it, as I said before, as a threat or as a challenge? I can pretty much guarantee you, if this is something that's causing you anxiety, keeping you up at night, you're viewing it as a threat, which, not surprisingly, is not what we want you to be doing. Because when we are perceiving things as a threat, we're sort of already in that red zone where, again, we feel like we're in danger. We feel like we're not going to be able to handle it. And when we're in that state, as I said, our brains get hijacked we sort of lose our higher level rational thinking. We often get tunnel vision, where we get this misperception there's only one way to deal with a problem. And so we don't look for other solutions. And then, the real issue is, what is that self-talk? The voice in your head at this case is probably saying, you can't do this. I can't handle it. This is going to be terrible. I'm going to be a failure. And unfortunately, of course, that has the tendency to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So to shift that thinking, you are going to really reframe this for yourself. How are you viewing it as a challenge? Because when you look at something as a challenge, you're sort of shoving yourself back into that eustress mode. You're making yourself think, okay, yeah, it's going to be hard. I'm not saying it's not, but let me figure out what I can do about this. So at that point, you're more likely to think of resources you have, reach out for additional support, get suggestions, get guidance, get training, make that plan. And at that point, the little voice in your head is, okay, I can handle this. So now, M from MHA and I met 15 minutes before this started so that we could make sure my Zoom setup was right. And it wasn't, and I had to reload something, but we had the time to do that. So, that was sort of, okay, this is a way that I can address the concerns about the technical issues. Then you're going to think about, okay, you've identified each of these, you've talked yourself into viewing them as challenges rather than threats. Now, this is really key. You're going to break each of those stressors down into whether it is something that is under your control or not under your control. And again, let's acknowledge there is a lot of stuff we're going to have to deal with that is not under our control. So if you can change it, how are you going to do that? And if you can't, how are you going to deal with your feelings around not being able to change it? So if it is under your control, what is going to be most helpful is taking a problem-focused strategy to coping with it. And so these are sort of basic steps, break it down. I often use the analogy that, when we're stressed, it's like there's this just solid brick wall blocking our view of any possible solutions. If you can break that brick wall down into a bunch of different piles of bricks, then you can address those one at a time. You're still going to have to deal with each of them, but you can figure out, okay, for this pile of bricks, I just need to get some more training. For this pile of bricks, I need to reach out to a loved one for a pep talk, whatever it is. So how are you going to cope with the things you can? And then for the things that you're not, at that point, trying to break down a brick wall that you really don't have any ability to change, at that point, really what you're doing is beating your head against the brick wall, which is not helpful. So instead, thinking through, okay, for the stuff that I can't change, how am I going to handle that? So these are just, some of the tips. And here we really get back to some of those more emotion-focused approaches, or that emotion-focused pathway to resilience. How am I going to control my breathing? How am I going to release the emotions? And that could be as simple as, okay, I am going to have a plan where, if you're in a chaotic situation, every 2 hours, I'm going to give myself permission to go hide in the bathroom and look at pictures of my kids or my pets on my phone so that I can recharge myself. Whatever it is that works for you. It doesn't matter what you do. What matters is you find what works and you do it repeatedly, because that's really what leads to that kind of significant change, that significant ability to build your resilience. So bringing it all together, and then we'll wrap it up and go back to the Q&A session. So first, you've appraised all your stressors, which doesn't appear on this chart, but you've identified them, just going with your gut. What is it that's bugging you? Are you viewing it as a threat? If so, how do you reframe it to talk yourself into viewing it as a challenge? Then is it something you can control or change? If it is, what are your problem-focused strategies going to be? If not, what are your emotion-focused strategies going to be? I'm sure many of you out there are thinking, this is the serenity prayer. It absolutely is. It is just taking the serenity prayer and putting it into action. I can never exactly remember it, but the wisdom or the courage to change the things I can, you all know it better than I do. That is basically what we're looking at. But doing that is this really active, conscious process. I hope, try it out. And I hope that that will give you kind of a new approach to potentially dealing with all of the stress that I'm sure you are all dealing with. So that is it. Here's my contact information. My Institute for Disaster Mental Health, we've got the URL here. We've got other trainings and resources. If anyone is interested in that, feel free to reach out to me or to the Institute. And with that, I will stop sharing, Em, and turn it over to some Q&A. I'm really curious to see what has come in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Yes, we've got a few questions so far, and we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. So like I mentioned, feel free to post your questions in the chat as we go through what we've got so far. So when individuals rely on their faith community for strength in coping with challenges, what is the role of faith leaders to proactively provide support in addressing extra stress?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think, well, one thing I will say is I think people on the mental health side of things, particularly psychologists, need to have much more respect for the role of faith in people's lives. We often come from sort of a secular perspective and kind of don't give enough credit or support for that. I think that the flip side of what I just said, I think, is that faith-based leaders, spiritual leaders, probably should give a little more, or not necessarily more, I'm sure many of them are doing this, but recognize the role of stress and mental health issues. Like there's often kind of a tendency to think, coming from that perspective, that only religion is the answer to things. But I think there needs to be sort of more collaboration between the two approaches to helping and supporting people. I think also really destigmatizing mental health issues. In some faith-based communities, there still tends to be a tendency to kind of not make it okay to talk about these issues. So I think just opening it up to that, sorry, I'm kind of fumbling around for an answer here because it's such a big question, but yeah, just having more of that openness about people's needs and concerns, and then some more kind of collaborative approaches. But I think faith-based communities can be incredibly helpful for people, but often people who are going through really difficult times, as I said before, may be struggling with their faith, and therefore not acknowledging that is really going to then kind of, feed into that further and kind of undermine the source of comfort and support and information. Because if you're feeling like everyone else in my faith-based community is viewing this as God's will and not struggling the way I am, that can be really kind of isolating and, make people feel like it's not okay to acknowledge, well, just telling me it's God's will, it really isn't working for me right now. So yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer. If people have better answers in the chat, I'd love to read them afterwards.
Great insight there. Yeah. A lot of people looking for more information on the quality of life assessment that you talked about. So more information on what that is and where they can find it.
Sure. So it's on the slide. I think the slides are going to get shared with people.
Yes.
I think
we'll send those out.
Great. I think it's just ProQol, PROQOL.com, I think is the website for it. Yeah, you can just download a PDF there, and it asks a whole bunch of questions where you rate yourself in terms of how much you're feeling each of these things. And it's very flexible. It's basically just for kind of any helping profession. They actually have it phrased so it's like, like helping, but then you can replace that with teaching or counseling or, whatever it is that especially applies to you. So it's just a way, as I said before, it's just a great way to kind of get that kind of quantifying what you're feeling. Often we have that sort of general sense, proqual.org, I just saw, thank you. General sense like, something's not quite right here. But tracking your responses over time really is helpful to see, okay, I am definitely having a lot worse on the compassion fatigue and burnout scales and a lot less on the compassion satisfaction. So what is causing that? And again, here, maybe you can do some stress inoculation or just some active problem solving. What is it that's changed in that month? Is it just more and more of the same, or is there a particular issue that I'm dealing with that is causing this? So it's just a great way to kind of identify where maybe you need to do a little bit of focus, or to say, oh, okay, I am, I thought I was enjoying my job and I am enjoying my job. That's great. Not everybody likes it, but yeah.
You mentioned doing it once a month as a check-in, and I was thinking that that's such a great idea because it's hard to tell if your mental health is slipping just a little bit each day. It can be hard to notice until all of a sudden you're so much worse than you were doing before.
Exactly.
So yeah, great idea.
Yeah.
Is there a place for seeing a situation as a threat, especially if indeed it is? Someone said that they were thinking of people who are in threatening situations like the rise in domestic violence throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to downplay, stress inoculation is not going to do the trick for every single situation. There are situations that genuinely are dangerous and threatening. However, even with those, there may be some things that you can do about them. And so, some of that just, again, it's kind of like with the ProQual. It's just that really sort of breaking it down, getting beyond that general sense of, oh, I feel unsafe. Okay, what is it I'm feeling unsafe about? What are the like in domestic violence, what are the behaviors that I'm seeing? What are the behaviors maybe that are increasing as maybe my partner's stress level is growing? Certainly that was something we've been seeing a lot through the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, if it's not meant to be a way of fooling yourself. It is meant to be a way of thinking, okay, I don't want to say exaggerating, but am I taking less of an active view towards that particular element of stress when maybe it is something I can actually do something about? But yeah, absolutely. It's not going to solve every problem for sure.
Great. And how do we help children deal with these stresses? How can we take what we've learned today and help other people get through that?
I think, again, those 3 pathways to resilience, those will work from, toddlerhood on. Absolutely. There's so much new focus on teaching kids yoga and teaching kids mindfulness. I think that's awesome. Sometimes what kids need is just help identifying their feelings, identifying what they're going through if they don't have the language fully for that yet. So just being present for that. And I think also just validating. I will say this applies to across the age group. The things I talked about, like being sad because of missing a graduation. Maybe a kid was very sad or stressed because they couldn't have their birthday party. Well, to that young child, that's a huge crisis. And so we need to not downplay that. I think I'm really big on perspective taking, of trying to understand from the person that we are working with, helping, raising as a parent, whatever, teaching, whatever it is, what does this world feel like from their view? And what are some tools that we can give them? Because I think really, if we can raise kids understanding their own feelings and knowing how to address them, that's certainly a great service that we can try to give them.
Great. All right, I was going to move into the last question, but a great question just came in. So second to last question, how do we manage our relationships when going through and recovering from compassion fatigue? The ones we love the most can often feel the brunt of our stress expression. I think that is so true.
Oh boy, that is very true. That is a very hard question to answer. It might help a little bit to educate them about this notion so that they recognize, this isn't just, mom being cranky. This is a genuine occupational hazard. This is an injury that has been done to me by the stress of the work that I am trying to do. To again, kind of build that sort of empathy and understanding. I'm sort of reminded of, like, in cognitive behavioral therapy, part of that involves educating family members, support systems about what the person is going through. So they do have that understanding and hopefully a bit more patience and tolerance for it. And just, compartmentalizing if possible, but that's not always going to be possible if someone especially really is at that stage of true compassion fatigue or burnout, where it's, they've really kind of gotten into that crisis mode. But treating it as a real thing, this is not just, oh, I'm tired and I'm cranky. This is, as I said before, I have been wounded by the work that I'm doing, and now I need a period of time to recover from that and get back to being a healthy person and healthy professional again. I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, great. All right, and final question, any recommendations on other resources or readings, people looking for more information on this subject?
Let's see, I'm trying to think of specific ones. Again, on the Institute for Disaster Mental Health website, we've got some resources. Obviously, Mental Health America has a lot of resources. All the other trainings is probably the best clearinghouse for this information. I mean, basically all of the sort of professional organizations have guides and tips and videos. American Psychological Association, National Child Traumatic Stress Network has great resources for anyone who works with children. But I think I'm just going to go back to sort of just finding what works for you. And, you know, if that is a guided meditation app, that is awesome. If that is a fun puppy video, that's awesome too. Just the main thing is, you know, whether you're seeking out more formal training and resources, just really trying to build this into your routine so that, as I said before, it's not just lip service, because we really need to take care of ourselves. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, it is 3 o'clock on the dot, so we'll wrap there. Thank you so much for everything you've shared today. So much value came out of the last hour. And thank you to everyone who joined. Lots of great comments in the chat. And I saw someone ask if we will send out a copy of the chat. Yes, I will go through and clean that up and anonymize everything so that you all have the comments and resources that people posted, because lots of great content in there. So I'll be in touch with everyone in the next few days with the follow-up materials, and I'll include the link to request your certificate of attendance in there, and the slides and the recording. And thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks so much, Em. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Be well.